So I mentioned on a poetry news video a couple months ago that I wanted to read Jane Clark Scharl's new book, Pawns. And I did, and I'd like to do a brief review of it. Jane Clark Scharl is relatively new on the poetry scene. Her first major book, which the name of it I always butcher, is Sonner les matins, something like that. It's in French. And it's actually a verse play about St. Ignatius of Loyola and Rabelais and others. And it's sort of a conversation about the nature of life that's set, I think, during Mardi Gras. I haven't read the play yet. It got some buzz last year. And it kind of put Scharl on the map in this sort of like formalist yet experimental, interested in especially Catholic history and the history of European and Western poetry. Pawns was anticipated, and I think rightly so, for being kind of the more conventional collection of lyric poems that would follow up this odd and interesting verse play debut. When I came to Pawns, I expected to find a lot of formalist poems, and there are a lot of poems that are interacting with form. But one of the things that I think Scharl tips us off to early on in the collection is that she's not going to be too wedded to things like strict pentameter. So this is just a couple poems in a poem called Pomegranate. My heart is like a pomegranate. As a simile seems a little simplistic these days. Even the meter beats too neatly to strike true, but nonetheless there's something to it. And then it goes on and meditates on the pomegranate in a capable and lovely way. But this idea that the meter beats too neatly to strike true, even how that's written is very interesting. The meter beats, da 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 da, that's two iambs, but then too neatly, too and neat are both stressed syllables, so we have kind of a spondaic structure. Too neatly to strike true, so you have too neatly to strike true. That's a spondy, a Pyrrhic foot, and then a spondy. That is irregular, especially compared to the basic iambic meter of my heart is like a pomegranate and the meter beats. So Scharl here is kind of showing us she's not interested in exactly neat, even meter. And I think to come to this poetry collection looking for where the meter beats neatly and where it strikes true would be an interesting critical approach. One of the poems where the meter beats quite neatly is toward the end, and it's a poem that is actually a triolet. Triolets are fun poems in that they repeat two lines twice and one line three times. Sorry, they repeat the first two lines multiple times. So the first line is repeated again in the middle of the poem and then at the end of the poem. And the second line is also repeated at the end of the poem. Let me just read it and you'll pick up on it. In bright October, my children gather acorns. My mother's birthday would have been next week. She dreaded cold. Every year she mourned in bright October. My children gather acorns. They do not know what comes. To them, the shorn winter's just a game, a mythic freak in bright October. My children gather acorns. My mother's birthday would have been next week. So we have in bright October, my children gather acorns repeated 3 times. But the first time, it's said pretty straightforward, all as one sentence. In bright October, my children gather acorns, period. It's the first full line of the triolet, and it's a coherent sentence. But the next time we get in bright October, it's as the last part of a longer sentence. She dreaded cold. Every year she mourned in bright October, period. And then we have a new sentence, my children gather acorns, they do not know what comes. So what was originally words that made up one sentence are now split over the end of one sentence and the beginning of a second. that happens again the second time we get in Bright October, my children gather acorns, the second repetition. It's to them the shorn winter is just a game, a mythic freak in Bright October. My children gather acorns. Now that's a whole sentence to itself. My children gather acorns. So one of the cool things about a triolet is this repeating pattern can be played with when it comes to what grammatical meaning or position those repeated words have. Now, I think it's telling, and this is kind of, I think, a key to the whole collection, Pawns, that we have the repetition of my mother's birthday would have been next week, repeated exactly the same each time. And I think this is because Scharl wants that to stand out starkly. In many poems over the course of this collection, we have the dying mother, and it throws this sort of somber, mournful expectation of death, but also chance for reminiscing over many of these poems. And I think this triolet, which is just called My Children Gather Acorns, this triolet kind of sums up the difficulty of grieving the death of a mother, of watching your children not yet know the world, and of seeing the seasons change. So another aspect of Scharl's collection that I found interesting is Scharl has a few poems that are on the longer side, some of the longest poems in the collection, that are dramatic monologues from figures from either the ancient world or late antiquity. In fact, the title poem, Ponds, which I expected to be, maybe a lyrical pastoral meditation on ponds, turns out to be, and this is, I think, unique maybe in modern poetry, it's a dramatic monologue that says that it's the last words of Theodoric the Ostrogoth to his Magister Cassiodorus. So Theodoric the Ostrogoth, if you haven't checked your fall of Rome history recently, after Rome falls to the barbarians in the 470s, Theodoric is one of the great Gothic kings to rise and basically rule Rome in the 6th century. And very famously, he presided over the imprisonment and execution of the Christian philosopher Boethius. In this long poem, the poem is almost 4 pages long, which is certainly the longest poem in Scharl's collection. He's addressing Cassiodorus, his magister, who's also a figure from history, basically talking about that he's nearing death and he's meditating on the nature of man. And ponds come up in this odd way. He says, "Do you remember that long spring when for weeks the rain up country fell and befouled the river with mud? Ah, and you were always laboring at building your useless little ponds, even on days when the frost still clung at dawn to the soil, those fish ponds to which you wanted to bring, you said, the river as it ought to have been. Go, boy," he says a little later, "go to your ponds. I know you are longing to. Go. Yes, what a little thing is life, and littlest of all its passing. A raindrop's ripple on the water, stirring up reflections of clouds, sky, a pink budding locust tree ruffled by the breeze. I find some solace in that breeze, perhaps still as over the surface of your ponds, in the stillness to which I go, it moves." It's such a wonderful blending of what could be extracted from the historical context, just kind of a beautiful description of wind on water, a raindrop's ripple on the water, stirring up reflection of clouds, sky, a pink budding locust tree. In fact, there are several other poems in this collection that are mostly just that kind of thing, lyrical descriptions of nature. But towards the end of the book, Scharl puts this poem in that draws that kind of lyrical language about nature up into a larger meditation from a particular historical character on the fleetingness of human life and the place of the beautiful in a whole life considered, but by someone who's rich and powerful and presumably experienced some of the highs and lows that can be experienced by any human. The other thing that's striking to me here is, Cassiodorus is this scholarly figure. And apparently Cassiodorus, at least in the world of the poem, has this kind of pond building project, trying to maybe improve on the natural flow of the water through the kingdom. I can't help but think that this building little useless ponds is an image of the poet writing poems, thinking that, oh no, I'm kind of gathering words together in these ways that improve upon language, as it casually exists, but also maybe is criticizable as a useless task. And yet in its very beauty, in the very beauty of talking about that maybe it's useless, kind of proves its at least aesthetic power to us. I don't know that Scharl is necessarily thinking that, but I suspect she is. Scharl has written a lovely collection. I encourage you to check it out. Once again, that's Ponds by J.C. Scharl. The meter doesn't always beat neatly, but that's intentional. And Scharl's worth keeping an eye on for the future.